So save plan, you can file separate. I think the biggest one that's going to make things complex for people is the file separately thing. Now that's in play for everybody
Yeah,
with the
so
save plan.
it's in play for everybody with the save plan, and most of the other plans already had that feature. So basically, there were some old strategies where it made sense to like file separate, but be on a plan that took into account some other income. But you can just strike that from the record because it doesn't matter anymore. But yeah, so you can file separately and then it only takes into account your income on the save plan. Whereas the old repay plan did not have that feature. It always took your income and your spouse's income, lumped them together to make the payment calculation, which
Yep. So there can be some pretty big advantages there as well. Or it's really good, I guess, at a starting point, it's good to have that option. I mean, you want to have that option in your back pocket to be able to explore that strategy. So there's all kinds of strategies. And if you end up going down the path of like filing separately, we're talking strategy. So there's all kinds of strategy that goes with this whole file separately thing, because if you, depending on which spouse and how it's working, like there can be times where it's like, okay, well, if say Mary spouse and John spouse number two, say Mary's got the one that's got the student loans and then her income is lower, then maybe we're going to say file separately and isolate her income for student loan calculation purposes. And then maybe even take it further. Like, let's make sure she's maxing out retirement plans pre-tax, and then maybe even further and say like, you have an HSA plan that's a pre-tax thing and John's got it on his plan, but like it needs to be on Mary's plan because she gets the extra kicker with the. So those strategies have been around for a while, but like now they're open to pretty much, it's a much broader swath of the population that's going to, they're beneficial, but they're complicated.
yeah, so maybe the choice to be on the plan is not as difficult.
No.
Or the save plan makes a lot of sense, but the choice on how to file taxes has become something that's going to take a little bit more effort.
Yeah, because you're like, how do I file separately? How do I know? How do I calculate filing separately? You go to your accountant, they're like, you're an idiot for filing separately. Why would you ever file separately? So then it's like, why would I consider filing separately? But the accountant doesn't know what they're talking about usually for student loan planning purposes.
That's a good point. Student loans are not a part of the tax code. They're not part of anything that the average tax preparer is going to come across in even it doesn't impact the tax return itself usually, unless loan deduction, interest deduction, but that's about it for student loans on the taxes.
Right.
To go in the other direction, it makes a big difference.
Right.
So how do you decide? I mean, you've done a lot of these in the past, Andrew. How did you counsel people whether to file separate or joint?
It was really just a matter of running the numbers. See, well, if we're working with you, we can run the numbers on this student loans and that kind of thing. If you're doing it yourself, you need to have a way to run the numbers on what your payment is going to be in different scenarios. So that's what we can do, is we can run the payment that you would in the future have based on different scenarios. So in this example, the scenario we're going to run the numbers on are the scenario where you're filing jointly versus the scenario you're going to file separately. We can run the different payments on those two scenarios and show you the difference between the two payments. So if it's like $600 a month on the jointly scenario and then $400 a month on the separately scenario, so that means you're saving $200 a month by filing separately in this example. So $2,400 a year by filing separately. So that's step one, is we calculate the cost difference of the two. And then step two is like, you got to run the tax numbers. So that's where the accountants come into play. Like a lot of times they don't realize that in most cases, when you file separately, it hurts you on taxes, like 99% maybe of the time. It makes it worse to file separately. So accountants are like, what are you talking about? Like, I know that doesn't make sense. So that's why you have to be like, well, I know it doesn't make sense on my taxes, or maybe you preemptively say that. You're like, this is not about necessarily saving taxes. It's a student loan thing. It's going to affect my student loan. So I need to know what the cost is. So we would word it like, we were trying to figure out the cost, the added cost of filing separately on my taxes so that I can weigh that against the added benefit for PSLF purposes. Because we've already calculated you're saving $2,400 a year on payments. And if you're going for PSLF, that's pure savings. Like that's money in your pocket. So we need to calculate the tax cost of filing separately. So tax costs, usually filing separately costs more in taxes than filing jointly. So we get the accountant to run those numbers, or you do it in TurboTax. it's kind of difficult to do it in TurboTax because you have to run two completely different tax scenarios, but you can do it. So you just got to run those numbers and compare the total tax due in one versus the other, and say that number is, say, $400. In other words, the tax cost is $400 for filing separately. That's a win because your net benefit is $2,000, $2,400 PSLF benefit versus $400 tax cost. I'll take the $2,000, which is the difference of the two. And those numbers can be that's just a random number scenario I came up with off the cuff, but like the numbers we're seeing, sometimes it can be substantial benefits.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for me to see the payment difference being $20,000 a year by filing separate. And so, of course, so $20,000 a year savings on student loans. And let's say let's say I have to pay $10,000 more in taxes. Which would you choose?
Well,
I would choose the more money.
I would choose the $20,000 PSLF benefit, but I could see where that would be a hard decision because like the 10,000 tax due is like now. They're like,
that's true.
You got to pay them right now. So I have worked through that decision with a lot of people, and it's not so easy. Even if it's like straightforward, it's not so easy to say like, I got to write a check for 10,000 now for a probable future thing. And at some point now, if it's 10 years from now, I'm going to be like, yeah, I'll probably do it because I have confidence in the PSLF program. But like, I'm a little uncomfortable about that because I know the future is uncertain. So I like it more when it's like $1,000 tax costs for $20,000 PSLF savings.
Yeah. You're not kidding. Okay.
But the 10,000, 20,000, I would still do it. And like, if you're 5 years away from forgiveness or less, like say you're 1 year away from forgiveness, that's a pretty easy decision because you're going to get it in a year. But like the 10-year away from forgiveness, it starts to get hard to write checks now versus getting benefits 10 years from now. But generally speaking, yeah, I mean, you want to take the net of all things better off outcome.
Yeah, that's a very fair way of framing that as well, of how much it hurts to write a $10,000 check now.
Yeah, well. Right. It's not, I've never had anybody like rave about that kind of thing.
Turns out I'm heartless, Daniel.
Oh, Jeff.
There we go. Well, any other places? So I can think of one other area where this gets a little bit more complicated for your strategy.
Yeah.
New save plan. But anything else you wanted to touch on with the area we were at?
Filing separately and jointly. It gets a little, were you going to talk about community property states?
Oh, I wasn't even going to go there, but yeah, that's a good one.
I mean, it gets, if you're living in a state that has community property, let's Google the community property. Do you know them off the top of your head?
I'll basically make an L down the West Coast over to Texas, and then what is it? Wisconsin. I don't know how Wisconsin got involved in the community.
Yeah, that's the weird one. Washington, Idaho, Nevada, California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Louisiana.
That's right, all the way to Louisiana. The L.
And what's the other one? Wisconsin.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Wisconsin's a weird one. So if you're in one of those states, it's a little different for how you verify, or for when you file taxes separately, they split the number equally.
Mm-hmm.
Like they just cut the total household income in half. They make you do that in community property states. Whereas in all the other states, when you file separately, they allow you to split it based on what each spouse earned. So why that's important is because if you live in one of those community property states, it's going to be a pretty dramatic, well, if both you and your spouse make exactly the same income, this is irrelevant. But like most of the time, that's not true. So if you're in one of those community property states and both spouses work and it's not the exact same income, it's going to be potentially a big difference in how this thing shakes out versus in all the other states.
I'll just put this plug out there. If you are in a community property state and trying to go through this, it is well worth the effort to engage with somebody that has worked on these types of plans before. Yeah, it provides a whole lot of options there if you're in a community property state. Yeah,
there are plenty of people nowadays, or we can tell you, Jeff is one that you can pay him to give you student loan advice. There's other student loan planners that will give you specific advice on this thing. Like we're talking like several $100s, like $500 or so on average. These people typically charge. we're getting into like the super complicated scenarios with the community property states, and especially if both spouses have student loans. Like that's to me the most complicated is both spouses have student loans, both spouses work in a community property state. It gets really complicated fast there. So that's a time when a lot of times people are paying for advice for even some of the more basic type stuff because it gets complicated pretty fast. But we're getting into some of the most complicated stuff is when we start talking community property states. So you just have to have that in your back pocket of something to be aware of. If you're in one of those states, it's kind of different than normal rules for taxes.
The good news is that if you are in that situation, did you know a community property state is now a situation?
It's a situation.
But if you are in a community property state, you're not going to be, you can only be better off, I would put it this way, by using the rules that are available to you in a community property state.
Yeah. You just have to be aware of it.
But yeah, it does create more exciting analysis in student loans.